A few years ago, there was a TV commercial, an Old Spice commercial, I think, about a guy that would appear in a scene and then it would transform and he was moving along and it would become absurd and there were dolphins diving over molten chocolate and it was just the craziest thing, and he was going through these transformations so quickly. Reminded me of the first time I saw The Fast and the Furious, the movie. You know, the most recent ones I can't even watch because they move so fast. It makes me so furious. It drives me insane. I can just hold the camera still, I'm yelling at them. So I can make some meaning out of it. It's not just TV commercials and movies though. Don't we feel like life moves too fast sometimes? Almost all the time? But if we slow down, what's the alternative? Are our only two choices as a church to be super busy and not have any meaning, or to be dead? Answer to the question found in Congregations in a Secular Age. Andy opens up the book after talking a little bit about what the secular age is, which we talked about in our first video. But it starts to talk about why churches and why people might be depressed. And he talks about the fact that it's not just that there's change going on, it's the rate of change, and it's the fact that there isn't really an end in sight to the change. If you imagine that your church life was starting to move and starting to have some energy and starting to have some change and some vitality, and on a graph it was going up. In the past, it may be that you are actually aiming for something in which you could end. You'd find a spot to rest. We've established that system, or we've got that figured out, or we know how that works. And so you're no longer changing, you're maybe tweaking, or you're continuing to do it as it is and as it's been working. And so there's a kind of change that happens there where you could introduce a new program, or you could tweak something in worship, and you would know that you've met your goal. And that's fine, and that's good. And you might be able to add something else now, but you don't have to. You're happy and satisfied with what has happened. The problem that Andy is talking about is that in a secular age, time has no goal outside of itself. And so it just keeps on going, and it just keeps on going, and it just keeps on going. And there is never an end to the change. You're in the state of perpetual invention, not just of yourself, but even as a congregation, of your life together. There's never enough time to discover who you are and who you should be. Because as soon as you discover who you are and who you should be, you're on to the next who you are or who you could be. It's exhausting, but it also leads to sort of despair because there's no end in sight. It's like going on a road trip and saying, are we there yet? And the answer always and forever being, no, we're not there yet. So we can get lots of consultants to help us develop that momentum, and we can spend time as a church figuring out how to get that momentum and how to move towards that change. But ultimately, because time no longer has a goal, but it's the actual change itself and the search for authenticity and the search for who we are that is the goal, that search never ends. And we'll always be frustrated. because the line will go up, but as soon as we stop, it's not a plateau, it's a drop. We stop being authentic, we stop being who we should be, and at that point, we become depressed. So let's just talk for a second about the church that I'm standing in. It's a little country church. I'm really out in the country, mostly farms. It's a little village. And some of these people have been here, their families have been here since the church was founded in 1823. It's an established, long-time congregation, but it's tired. Maybe not obviously, but it's tired. It has a hard time keeping up with the demand for change. And there are lots of folks who would be quite happy not to change, that they have rejected this idea of a secular time. They've rejected the idea that there is something that's driving them to search for authenticity, in part because they have connections, and we'll get to that in a second, but they have connections so they don't need to manufacture or to discover themselves. They know who they are. But there are others, often those who are new to a community or new to this community, who are looking for something, and they're looking for something to help them discover their own selves. And this is the bind that Andy describes, is that the individual is looking for themselves, and they see that the church is traditionally supposed to offer some kind of meaning. And so they come to church, or they are connected to a church, and they expect it to give them some meaning. But in the process, they've discovered that the church isn't keeping up. And so now the church starts to make demands that it needs to change to find out who itself is. And now you've got the individual and the church both engaged in the same kind of search, both related to each other, but eventually it's only this person that's going to burn out and fall away, because it's exhausting to figure out their own life and to figure out the life of the church. And so somebody that comes to a little church like this, they go, oh, there's not enough life, there's not enough energy. And by that they mean there's not enough change, and there's not enough busyness that's going on that's telling me, that is indicating that these people have found their authentic and true selves. It's horrible when you're part of that community and you begin to feel guilty that you can't do that. You can't figure out who you are, but also as a group, you can't figure out what is that magic bullet, what is that silver bullet that's going to solve all of our problems. And you find it, it solves your problems, but then because there's no end, you just have to keep on going. And as you do, people will drop away and then new people will come in. So the kind of stable community that this church was built on has now been destabilized because the expectations of the people aren't meeting what they can do together, and so they fall apart. One of the things that Andy assumes to be true in the secular age is that even though we've entered a different time and our relationship with time has changed, one of the basic drives of humanity has not changed. We are always going to be meaning-making creatures, that we are always going to be searching for something to make sense of our lives, but also to give our lives some value. And we are going to always be shooting for what Andy uses as a short form called the good life. And the good life can take different forms depending on what time we're in, and that is what he's describing. But don't lose sight of the fact that humans throughout history and throughout in every place are looking for what is the good life. How they define that is really important, and it will change depending on their time and their place. What Andy then is describing is a change in how we understand the good life. What makes life worth living? What makes it worth getting up every day for? Some of our answers might be kind of common sense. We might get up because we love our family. And that's true. There are going to be some common sense ways in which we can describe that. But on a deeper level, we have bigger questions. We have bigger questions about how we fit into the universe and how what happens to us as we live and when we die. How can we touch something that is beyond us? Because we have some sense that there is something that's beyond us. The good life and our understanding of that encapsulates all of that. As you think about the idea of a good life, when you engage with what Andy is talking about, he's saying that the good life for us is a busy life. When we are busy, we feel full. And when we feel full, we feel like we have led a good life. The problem that he outlines is that we can never end that busyness, because if we do, then we stop feeling full, and then we stop feeling like we've been moving towards the good life. We, as people, look for a busy church because we think that it's filled with the good life. And then when we get engaged, it's not that we get upset. We might have a conflict. We might have some disagreement. But ultimately, what Andy is saying is that we don't leave that church because of that conflict or getting upset. We leave because we can't keep up. That there's too much busyness. And so we have to drop off in order to be able to pursue our own. It's that double bind that we've talked about. So the question, I think, becomes, for a church like this small country church, and maybe for your church, is how do you imagine the good life? Now, at the end of the book, you might have changed your mind about what that means, but the Christian answer has often had something to do with enjoying God and loving God forever, or having the benefits of God in their life, maybe eternal life, doing the things that will lead me to having eternal life. These are sometimes the answers that are given. And the problem, I think, with those often is that, at least in a secular age, is that they don't really make sense, because they have an end. And it's not about me. Its end is, in life or life after death. Its end is in God. So my goal is to be with God. But then in doing that, I somehow aren't searching for my own self, my own authentic self. And so there's a mismatch between these two things. So when you think about your worship life, and when you think about the life of your congregation, the busyness of what goes on, and when you put all of those events down on paper, what seems to be your idea of the good life? Is it anything other than busyness? A short story. A friend and colleague is a consultant, a church consultant, and he administers this survey into congregations, and he finds that many congregations are very good at doing things. They reach out to the poor, and they have social dinners, and they have worship on a regular basis. They know and they visit elderly people. They do all of these things, but they really struggle to connect with why they do them. They're not entirely sure, and even after a year or more of working with the congregation, he often struggles to have people connect their why with their what. I think that's in some ways what Andy is describing. My friend, the consultant, says these are churches that are like chickens with their heads cut off. They know how to run around, but they don't know why they're running around or where they're going. It's the busyness of doing that means that they never actually connect their why. My suspicion, at least from Andy's perspective, is that it's because there is no why outside of the busyness that we have lost the connection to a good life that makes sense in the lives, our own lives, and in the lives of our congregations. What about yours? Can you make sense of what the good life is? All of this talk of change is also talk about time. And this is one of the sections in the book in which we're going to spend a lot more time talking about time as we move into section 2. And it's important, I think, at this point to understand that what Andy's argument rests on is that there used to be a connection between sacred and secular time, that these two different times acted in coordination with each other. In secular time, we have severed that connection, and sacred time has become something that is individual or is personal or is outside of the main way in which we keep time, which has no reference to God or to any kind of reality outside of what we see and experience here. In some ways, the secular age, which is by definition a time period, is really about that severing of sacred and secular. Because all societies keep time. They just do so in different ways. And in some ways, the way that we do is, at least in North America, is out of step with how a lot of the world through time and even now is. You may have traveled in other countries and you might have experienced this. I lived in Africa for a time, and their sense of time isn't oriented around a task, which is busyness, which is the way that secular time gets oriented. It was often oriented around a relationship. So if on their way to a meeting, somebody stopped them, they'd have a chat. It wasn't even if they wanted to, it was that, well, I have to find out about how your family is doing and how are things back at home and how's your work going and are your crops good? And before long, there's this 20-minute, 30-minute catch-up session going on as the person is walking to a meeting which was supposed to have started 20 to 30 minutes ago. You know, sometimes we'll put down other cultures. We'll say, oh, I'm on island time, which means that I'm keeping time where it's about my enjoyment or my pleasure rather than about getting things done. But when we say things like that, we betray the fact that we do want to get things done, that busyness is just ingrained in the way that we see the world and time. But it hasn't always been like this. Secular time used to be defined against sacred time, and sacred time was the most important time. It was the time in which God acted in the world, and it connected us to those events in which God was present in the world in special ways. Time really seemed to slow down during festivals, and Lent and Advent, for instance, were a slowing down of secular time to bring it in line with sacred time, so that when the incarnation happened or when the resurrection happened, we were ready for that. But now Christmas is really in relationship to Black Friday, and Easter doesn't have the same kind of defining way of shaping time for us. We've severed sacred and secular. And when we've done that, we've now created a new way of keeping time. What the book Congregations in a Secular Age is really going to try to struggle with is how do we, as the church, who is supposed to be connected to the sacred, how do we exist in a world that doesn't keep time in that way anymore? And even more, how do we not get caught up in secular time and remain sacred? Because our imaginations are no longer able to imagine what it is to live in sacred time. We have been so shaped by secular time. We have so bought into the busyness, and we've so bought into the good life as defined by busyness, that there's now no difference between the life inside our church and the life outside of our church. We're caught up in secular time. And as section 2 of this book is going to show us, that has some big problems for us as the church. At times, Andy uses philosophical or theological words that maybe we don't use in everyday life. And one of those was ontology, ontology. And it really means the study of being, which sounds a little silly, I guess, to folks, because what else would there be except for being? But it's trying to figure out who we are, or what is matter in the universe, what holds it together, what gives it meaning, how are we in the world. And it relates because one of the things about our being is that we are in time. It's not something that we've chosen. And we wish that we could create more time. We joke about it. We wish that there were 25 hours in a day, or that we could somehow stop time, but we can't. It seems to, at least in our Western understanding, seems to move linearly forward, always without stop. And we can't do anything about that. So our being is tied because we are bound, we act within time. Our ontology is connected to time. This becomes important when we think about the elements, when we think about one of the most basic Christian acts that there is, which is communion, the Lord's Supper. At that moment, we think something happens. Now, some think that God becomes present, that the very blood and bread changes substance. Its being, its ontology changes. Not the actual molecules, but the essence of it changes, and God is present there. But even if you don't go all the way to there, many Christians would say that there's somehow some sort of real presence of God that is there when those elements are constituted in the community. We eat this bread and we drink this wine, not just in remembrance, but as part of participating in the being of Jesus. This makes less sense in a secular time because what we're saying is that God somehow breaks into that moment and is present there. And that's why the severing of the sacred and the secular is so troubling for the church and so difficult for it to be able to accommodate, because we can't fit our basic claims into a secular time. They're by definition sacred claims. And when we sever that connection, we no longer have a witness that we can give to the world. As we move through the book, we're going to see that there are other problems, but we will return back to this idea of sacred reconnecting with secular, or with God becoming present in the secular world. Because just because we have severed the connection between sacred and secular time doesn't mean that God has. And God continues to show up. The whole point of the book in the end is to say, how can congregations find God showing up in our midst, even if we don't recognize it, Him, God, at the start?